right. So now that we're done with that admin type stuff, we get to pick up today where we had left off last time. So we had left with the promise of talking about the discussion about whether non-human animals can develop language. And this is one of those concepts that we've kind of dropped the hints for throughout this lecture, I guess throughout the whole course, because I talked about some of my own research that kind of butts up on this topic. So I had mentioned that I work with the black-capped chickadees and that they produce calls, and in those calls they have 4 distinct note types, and those note types only occur in a very particular order. So A notes, then B notes, then C notes, then D notes. And those notes can be duplicated or omitted, but they're always going to come in that order. So if there are A notes, they're going to go at the beginning. And if there are D notes, they're going to go at the end. So when we look at that, we might argue that that would be something that has grammar. There are rules denoting the order of those particular notes. But as I mentioned, I'm in the process of trying to publish a paper that was looking at whether the order of these vocalizations matters to these chickadees. So I actually looked at whether they could distinguish between correctly ordered and incorrectly ordered note types. And it seems that they do care about the order. So they'll learn just a little bit differently between the 2 different categories, following an operant conditioning setup, kind of like what I described in my little mini lecture on operant conditioning in chickadees. But in writing up that paper, I've run into this issue where there's a lot of contention in the field of linguistics, and especially in terms of non-human animal communication. So we're going to touch very briefly on some of those topics and some of the issues that people have. So you'll find that I tend to use a lot of fairly hedging language when having this discussion because there's a lot of debate here. And so when people ask about language in non-human animals, it really depends on how you're defining language. And so that's the issue that I'm currently working through with my paper. I have my co-authors have come back and said, we need to change the wording here because we can't use language. We also can't use communication. We also can't use information because those are all loaded terms in that field. And so if you're going to use a term, especially in this field, you're going to see that in those early paragraphs, there's going to be a very precise definition of what that term means to them. So when they talk about communication, they're going to specify maybe the transmission of a signal from one individual to another. So no implications of information, just that the signal moves from one point to another. Or maybe they're going to talk about the change in behavior being their interpretation of a passed along signal. So they end up with these very precise definitions for that very meaning. So if you ever look into this kind of literature, if it's something you're interested in, you'll find that out fairly quickly. But as I said, this ties into what I've been doing because when I talked about our black-capped chickadees, I mentioned the fact that I am interested in them and lots of people study them and other songbirds because they are specifically vocal learners, which means that they have to learn their vocalizations by listening to an adult of the same species. And at the time, I mentioned that songbirds are not the only group that do this. Humans are another. We also see it in dolphins and sea lions and whales and parrots and other primates. And in fact, we start seeing that those species are fairly extensively listed at the very top of this slide here. And this is because a lot of the same species that have been identified as vocal learners have also been studied in terms of their ability to acquire language. And then another weird part of this study is sometimes they're looking at sort of the natural communication systems that exist within these species. So they might ask, how do dolphins communicate with each other? What do their sounds mean? Though meaning is another one of those contentious terms. But some other research, and specifically a lot of what the textbook focuses in on, is whether or not they can acquire human language, which is a very different question. So it's not so much asking about their own natural language abilities, it's just saying, can they learn to communicate with humans? And so there's some really neat research. So with dolphins, a lot of the language research involves having basically a giant keyboard with a bunch of buttons on it, and each button has a different meaning. So some of them are for items, and some of them are for actions. And so there's a button that would say correspond to each of the dolphins in the pool. So maybe they're going to say that dolphin A should play. So that dolphin who's pressing buttons is saying that they want to play with dolphin A. What they do find in a lot of these studies, because I mentioned that I attend a conference every year where we look at comparative cognition, meaning cognition in non-human animals, and a big chunk of that is looking at communication. So we have people who do this research. I get to sit down and chat with people who work with dolphins. And apparently the dolphins most of the time will just ask for fish. And specifically, they ask for their favorite kind of fish. So if there's an option, they will sit there and hit give cod over and over and over again until they get cod, even though they have a whole arrangement of buttons that they could be pressing. They do show some understanding, so they will occasionally, if you do an action and ask them what you've done. So if you put a ball in the pool, then maybe they'd push the buttons for give ball, because that's what you've done. But with these types of sort of sentences, or I guess phrases, this kind of lines up to what we had talked about as telegraphic speech, where we have sort of a singular verb and a singular noun, and that's it. So there isn't necessarily a proper order, it's just the bare bones of meaning. So there's some debate there about what's going on. And with a lot of these species, even with the other primates, our closest relatives, we have issues where they don't have the same vocal apparatus as us. So they might learn to understand, or at least sort of respond in appropriate ways to human-based verbal commands. So you can tell a dolphin to do something and they will then do it, but we don't necessarily know if that's sufficient to call it language or communication. So we're going to see a lot of overlap with some of our operant conditioning and some of our learning topics with whether or not it's communication or not. I don't know a whole heck of a lot about sea lions. That's one area where, when it comes to vocal learners, the research is fairly recent, and I don't know anyone who works with sea lions. But this year at the conference that I go to, we had someone come in as a guest speaker, and it was the lady who worked with Alex the parrot. And I'm terrible at names, so I can't tell you what her name is, but if you Google Alex the parrot, she was his handler. And so if you've heard of Alex the parrot, he was an African gray who lived to be quite old, and he was being sort of worked with in order to decide or determine if parrots could have more advanced mental capacities. And at the time of his death, because Alex ended up dying, he was only about 40 or so, which for an African gray is fairly young. But he was at the time showing this ability to do math problems. And he could express different concepts. So when she was talking about some of the studies that they were doing right around the time of his death, they were able to show him, say, a tray full of different objects. And so there'd be different colors, and some of them would be keys, and some would be blocks, and some would be sticks. And so she could say, Alex, how many red keys? And he could count up all the red keys, and he'd know the difference between non-red keys, so he wouldn't count blue ones, and he'd know the difference between red things that were not keys, so he'd ignore red blocks and red sticks. So he could count up that way. Or she could ask, how many red and blue keys? And he would count those, ignoring everything else. And so he had this sort of more abstract concept going on. So he was able to describe these different situations and showed a good understanding for the language. But again, it was right on the edge of, but is this something that they do on their own, or is it just from lots and lots of training with humans? So they were looking for something sort of more spontaneous or at least novel statements. But she was very disappointed because she had worked with him for decades at that point, and then he ended up passing away. So I don't know if she's tried again with different birds or not, but it was a really interesting talk. And then, of course, typically when you think of non-human language, we think of chimpanzees and other primates. And that's where most of the literature has focused, just because they're so close to us. And so again, we see lots of situations where we're looking at whether or not they can acquire human language. So situations of can they follow human verbal directions, but also things like can we teach them sign language? Can we teach them to use lexicograms, which are basically symbols? So usually they'll have cards with different symbols, and each symbol has a particular meaning, and they can point to collections of symbols to get across a particular statement. So they've done lots and lots of research on that. And so a couple of the very famous situations, you might have heard of Washoe, who is a chimpanzee who ended up having a vocabulary of over 160 different words. So that was pretty successful in that research. So they learned to speak ASL, American Sign Language. And we started seeing sort of combinations into simple sentences. But again, this is a species learning human language, not their own language. So keeping that in mind with the questions that we're asking. Yep. Possibly. There's quite a few of them. I have a lot of trouble keeping them all separate. We only talk about two. We talk about Washoe, and then we're going to talk about Kanzi, who was, I think, a bonobo, but same kind of setup. I don't know tons of story behind it. Oh, yeah, I don't know. I don't know much about the past for it. Yeah, not my experience. No, that's fine. There's probably quite a bit of backstory here because, again, with non-human animals that live for a very, very long time, there's quite a bit of history there. And a little bit of experience that I do have. One of my PhD co-office mates, she's gone to the Toronto Zoo and is working with their primates there. But a lot of the laws and regulations around housing primates have completely been overhauled in the last few decades, where they can't bring new ones into captivity. So it's getting harder and harder to do this kind of research. So it's now only being done in labs where they already had primates, but they're not able to bring in more, which is good because it's preventing sort of that influx of wild animals being brought into the lab. I don't know. They'd probably need special approval for stuff like that and like proof that they weren't intentionally injured. But I think that there are also like rehab centers where they would maintain sort of injured wildlife and then like as natural of a setting as possible. But it's another one of those like ethical big overhauls in very, very recent times. But yeah, so many things that we could talk about here. That's all right. It's like I've said, this is my area of expertise for some of it anyways. So I enjoy talking about it. But the thing that we're going to focus on here with Washoe is despite the fact that they have this pretty broad vocabulary, we only see that kind of telegraphic language where we have the correct verbs and the correct words, sort of, but there isn't really any evidence of a proper structure. We don't see grammar or syntax or any of that for proper arrangement. We just see symbols or signs that are related to what's going on. So more of that, they're able to mimic human language, but not necessarily use it in a generative way. And then one of the neat parts is when we look at this bonobo, Kanzi, who's our next sort of big name in non-human animal language. And this was, Kanzi used symbols, so lexicograms, so images that they could point to. And they actually, the unique part here is they taught another bonobo the symbols that they knew. So we got to see between those two individuals transmission that didn't involve the handlers. So they actually shared what they knew, and we got to see another organism sort of pick up on it without human intervention, which was very, very cool. And so again, here we're seeing that the production isn't necessarily there. We don't have the proper order of words to produce sort of full sentences in a logical order, but we did see pretty good understanding. So they had good receptive language, meaning that if a human could give a command, they could follow out those requests or commands pretty successfully most of the time. So we see that they understood quite a bit more than maybe they could sign themselves or that they could indicate themselves. And when we start looking at some of their brain scans, they started seeing that activities involving communication, things like signing, were also using an area kind of close to Broca's area in humans. So the idea here is, again, maybe, okay, so there's some evidence that they have the capacity to pick up on this, but maybe they're lacking some of that innate structure that humans have. So if we talk about kind of transitioning to our next slide, where we start talking about evolutionary context, because most other species don't have the same vocal structures that we do, maybe they never had that natural selection push into vocal communication. So they have a lot of the same brain areas as us, and they can be used for picking up communication, but they're not set up in the same way that we are, where we're innately ready to acquire language. Maybe, theoretically. But again, I like to point out that a lot of this research isn't necessarily looking at their own innate communication methods. A lot of that gets overlooked. All right, and so then this idea of language in an evolutionary context, we kind of mentioned this briefly in passing as we've gone through, but I wanted to include this extra note where we can talk about it a little bit more in depth. And we're starting to, again, make connections between earlier topics. So we've already talked about evolution and natural selection a couple of times. But evolution just being that idea of a particular trait changing long-term in a population. And evolution happens because of natural selection. So we have a particular trait, and that trait is going to be beneficial for the individual that has it. So it's going to increase fitness, which is their fancy way of saying that you will probably live longer and reproduce more, which means that that gene, that trait, gets passed along to your offspring. And because you're reproducing more, that's going to make up more of the population in the future. So over time, we start seeing more and more of that particular trait. And so here we can consider language itself as a trait. And so that trait could be the product of natural selection, where our ability to acquire and use language actually came about because it was beneficial to acquire and use language. And if we sort of logic our way through this, there's quite a bit of storytelling that we could do. So if we think about it, secondhand knowledge, someone telling you something, is a whole lot less resource intensive than figuring it out yourself through trial and error. Especially if we think of things like finding food and avoiding danger. Somebody saying, don't go over there, there's a bear, is a whole lot better for your health and longevity than going over there and realizing there's a bear on your own. So that secondhand knowledge is a lot less dangerous than trial and error. And we see that these benefits actually get larger as our groups get larger. So if we think about it, as you get larger and larger groups, you're able to benefit from everyone in that group's existing knowledge. You can all share information. And so you have to relearn less and less because you can work with what's already there, what you've already experienced. And we start seeing generational knowledge, where people who have lived long lives and built up lots of experience can pass on that experience and teach those who come after. My brain just went completely blank there. But yeah, so we do see evidence sort of if we look at locations where human populations have lived, we see evidence that groups started getting larger and larger. And there's probably quite a bit of co-evolution, where as groups got larger, it was more beneficial to have language to sort of expand like that, to be able to communicate amongst each other. There's also some theories that talk about the fact that we have really large prefrontal cortexes as part of a sort of byproduct of larger groups like that, because it helps us remember individuals because we have to interact with more people. So there's lots of stuff that all gets tied together there. But so as the groups get bigger, we see more selection pressure on being able to acquire language, but being able to acquire language also allows those groups to get bigger. So we could see a runaway selection effect where it's going to push more and more. And so this is why when we talk about things like, yeah, there's probably some innate biological mechanism that allows us to acquire language. Because being able to acquire language, having this ability, and being good at it is beneficial long term. And there's also that social aspect where we learn from others' experience. And so they go together, where we get that sort of ability to pick up information from others. And then the information itself is beneficial, which leads us to sort of have more selection for the ability to pick up that language. So there's a complex social evolution and biological evolution all at once. And again, at least that's the theory. There are some people who argue against this, where they say that maybe there isn't a strong enough selection pressure for this to have happened. Other people have run models and said that very, very small sort of pushes can lead to the evolution of this kind of thing, especially in the lack of there being a downside. There's lots of debate, but as it is with a lot of these things that happened a really long time ago, we might never know an actual answer. So it's probably what's going on, at least according to most people. All right, and then our last of the random topics before we hop into problem solving is this interrelatedness of language, culture, and thought. And I've already kind of hinted at this topic earlier on, where I mentioned that there are some people who think that the language that we use shapes the way that we think about things. So the idea here is that the words that we have in our language limit how we can think about the things that we encounter. So this idea of linguistic relativity says that one's language determines the nature of one's thought. And if you've ever heard of linguistic relativity, you've probably heard about it in conjunction with Worf. So Worf's hypothesis. And this was sort of the first big push towards this concept, but so his idea focused in on the fact that if we look at English and Inuit, there are only, say, 2 words that describe snow in English. But if you look at Inuit, then there are 14 or more different words that describe snow. And so if we were looking at that ability to differentiate between different kinds of snow, then English speakers would be at a disadvantage because they only have 2 broad categories that they can fit it into, whereas Inuit would have many, many different categories and they could differentiate between all of them. Now, that was an interesting hypothesis, but when he published his work, this was all pretty much done as a lot of early psychology research was done, where it's quote-unquote research, and he thought about it and observed some situations where people talked about snow and called it good. So there wasn't an experiment to test that categorization ability. There wasn't any follow-up, no manipulations, no nothing, just some musing and some publishing. But since then, there's been lots and lots of follow-ups and lots of similar concepts. And a really good one was looking at the idea of color perception. So if we think of, again, English versus the Dani of Indonesia, they actually only have 2 words for color. So they have warm and cool colors, and that's all they distinguish. But in English, we can talk about yellow and orange and red and purple and so on. And we can have all these different words. And so when researchers have set up experiments that actually look at people's ability to differentiate between colors, those who have more color words actually perform slightly better on these differentiations. And so they've pointed to this as evidence for this linguistic relativity, where if we have the words to describe these different colors, we have a slightly different perception of those colors. We can tell them apart. Now, whenever I talk about this, I always take sort of a little bit of a step back and I propose something that makes this a little bit more complicated. And I say, okay, well, what if it has to do with experience? So I was talking a little bit about it earlier. When I was younger, I did a lot of art. So drawing, painting, all of that. And so I'd have experience with different colors. And so interacting with my non-artist friends, I would say, oh, maybe I'm picking a color for a room. And I'd show them the swatches that I have. And I'd say, which one is best? And they look at it and they go, they're all gray. What does it matter? Well, this one's a little bit green. This one has sort of a pink undertone. This one's warmer. This one's cooler. But they would see them all as gray. Whereas I would distinguish between them because I'm used to telling the difference between slight differences in color. So that would be my experience, allowing me to differentiate different shades. And so if we think about it, when we're children and we're learning English or whatever language we're learning, we're usually shown pictures. So here is a yellow thing. What color is it? Here's an orange thing, a blue thing. So we have experience separating them into those different categories. Whereas if your language only has warm versus cool colors, you're only used to differentiating between warm versus cool. So maybe experience plays a role there, and it's more experience than the fact that not having the word for it impedes your ability to differentiate. So maybe the difference doesn't matter because you've never had to categorize them before. So what I'd like to see is if they've done a study doing this, but looking at, say, artists versus non-artists, and see if there's a difference. Because I have a feeling that there's a lot of experience on top of this that makes it just a little bit more complex. But we do see some studies that, having controlled for a lot of other things, still find a slight influence, where the more words that you have, the better you are at making these differentiations. But overall, our big sort of finding after many, many years of study is that it's not as big of a thing as they thought it was. Because at the time, they thought that it was going to be a massive effect that completely changed the way that we look at the world. Whereas, in fact, it's more of a slight improvement in performance if you have more words. But yeah, so there's probably a lot more complex than they really thought. All right, so next we get to move on to problem solving. And so we're gonna just get started with our definition. So problem solving, we're gonna call that active efforts to discover what we have to do to achieve a goal that's not readily attainable. Basically, if a goal is readily attainable, then there's no problem. You can do the thing right off the bat. You don't have to solve anything. But if there's no immediate apparent solution, then we can call it problem solving. All right, and so we have different types of problems. We're going to actually break them up into 3 distinct categories. And so these are fairly arbitrary, but we're just describing the structure of the problems that we're looking at. So the first is problems of inducing structure. And these kinds of problems require us to discover relationships among numbers, words, symbols, or ideas. Basically, we have to understand and connect relationships. I'm just going to push this over. And with a lot of these, the textbook gives us some neat examples. So I'll give some of the solutions as we go through, but they give us the example of series completion problems and analogy problems. So these analogies, you might have seen these before in other classes, especially if you've worked through practice questions in textbooks. Textbooks love these kinds of questions. So if we have on the bottom here, we have merchant and sell is one pair, and then customer and blank. So sometimes if you see these written out, it would be merchant is to sell as customer is to blank, or sell is to merchant as blank is to customer. And to solve this problem, you'd have to figure out what's the relationship between merchant and sell, and what is something that has a similar relationship to customers. So our fill in the blank here would probably be buy. So merchants sell things and customers buy things. And then lawyer and client, doctor and blank, the blank would probably be patient. And so these are things where you have to understand those relationships and then extrapolate from there. You may have noticed by now in this class that I don't use these kinds of questions. I find that they're very subjective and they rely on people having a very particular ability to function like a thesaurus. And if they can't come up with the right word, they struggle with these questions. But I'd also much rather ask you a question that gets you to talk about something or think about a concept, as opposed to make some arbitrary connections here. But you'll probably see quite a few of these in other classes and other texts. So those are our inducing structure things, because we focused in on that relationship and understanding that relationship. Our next type of problem are problems of arrangement. So these require people to arrange the parts of a problem in a way that satisfies some criterion. Basically, they're going to say, here's the stuff you need to get to this point. How do you do so? And usually the parts, the different steps that you can take, can be arranged in a bunch of different ways, but only one or a few of those arrangements could form a solution. And the textbook again gives us some examples, the string problem and anagrams, which we'll look at on the next slide. But before we get there, I actually want to talk about insight, because these problems of arrangement are typically solved through insight. And we've already talked about the concept of insight in this class. So you might remember back when we were in our learning chapter, we were talking about Thorndike with his cats in the puzzle boxes. And we had mentioned that when he was doing that study, he was looking at the difference between gradual learning and insightful learning. And for gradual learning, which is what he was seeing, the cats would spend long periods of time in the puzzle boxes. They would gradually figure out which actions got them out sooner, and they'd perform those actions more often, so they would slowly be getting out of the box faster and faster and faster. So that would be incremental learning, sort of baby steps to getting to the solution. We had also mentioned insightful learning as our second option, where maybe we would see that the cats were trapped for long periods of time, and then all of a sudden they'd have that aha moment. And from then on, they'd get out immediately. We didn't see that with the cats, but in a lot of cases, when presented with these problems of arrangement, we have that aha moment. So we're faced with a problem and we aren't sure how to approach it, and then all of a sudden we see the solution, and then we know exactly what to do from there. So let's look at these two examples. The first being the string problem. So it says 2 strings hang from the ceiling but are too far apart to allow a person to hold one and walk to the other. On the table are a book of matches, a screwdriver, and a few pieces of cotton. How could the strings be tied together? And so the textbook gives the answer that if you tie the screwdriver to one of the strings and swing it like a pendulum and walk over and hold the other string, wait for it to come back and grab it while it's within arm's reach, and then tie them together. My solution to this one, as soon as I saw this question, will actually tie into a topic we'll mention in a few slides about functional fixedness, because my solution is to drag the table over. and stand on the table, because that gets you up higher where you could have the strings closer together. So there's a couple of different options here, but we'll come back to functional fixedness in a sec. For our anagrams, we are arranging our letters in a particular order. So instead of particular steps in order to accomplish your goal, tying the screwdriver to the string, swinging the string, walking over, and then tying them together, then we'd have, okay, put the letters in the correct order. So again, with this arranging things, and so we'd have these scrambled words, make them into proper English words, and we have water and joker. And for whatever reason, the J and the K in the last one threw me off. I had to actually check what the answer was. But as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh yeah, of course, obviously, that aha moment, but stimulated from the outside. All right, so those are our arrangements. And then our last category are problems of transformation. And so these require people to carry out a sequence of transformations in order to reach a specific goal. So we're looking at sequences again, but here we're specifically sort of changing the situation in between steps. And so this is kind of a weird one to visualize, but as soon as I show you the examples, it should click. So typically you'll see things like they give us the hobbits and orcs problem. You might have also seen it as wolves and sheep, or pigs and cabbage. I've seen lots of different iterations in different texts, or the water jar problem, which we have here. And so the hobbits and orc problem, I'm not going to read all of that because you could do that if you wanted to, but these are all set up the same, whether you've seen it as sheep and wolves or pigs and cabbages. There's usually a situation where you have two different groups and you have a boat that you have to use to cross a river, and you can't leave a certain number of one thing alone with the other. So here they're saying that you can't have the orcs outnumber the hobbits or they'll eat the hobbits. So you can have one of each left together, but you can't have two orcs and one hobbit. It would have to be 2 and 2, or else there's going to be bad things happening. And then only a certain number can fit in the boat at a time. How do you get them from one side to the other without anyone being eaten? And so there's lots of different ways to do this, but the solutions are usually fairly complicated. So this is the solution to this problem. So it looks like you can only fit 2 in the boat at a time. So those are the restrictions. And so that's how many different steps it would take to get from one end to the other. So these solutions can be very complex, and it's kind of weird because we're given our start point and we're given our end point, so we know where we need to get, and we know where we start from, and we have all these rules for how to get there, but we have to figure out what that sequence is, what changes we need to make in between in order to fulfill those rules that we've set out for ourselves. With our water jar problem, these are, again, something you'll see fairly commonly. There's usually 3 different sized containers, and they'll say using these containers, you need to pour out this particular volume. So this one is saying that, okay, so you have a 21 cup jar, a 127 cup jar, and a 3 cup jar. So you can draw and discard as much water as you need, but we need exactly 100 cups of water. So if we think about it, we would take one of the big ones, so get up to 127, then take away the 21, and then take away 2 3s. So that would get us down to 100. So that would be a solution for that, and you'd have to do it in that particular order to change the situation to what they want in the end. And we're actually going to revisit that one again with some of our issues with our sort of problem solving. Oh, perfect, right away. So the barriers to effective problem solving. Some of these are pretty logical, things like irrelevant information. You've probably encountered this on exams where there's information that isn't necessary for the solution, but it throws you off because you assume that it's part of the solution. So learning to ignore irrelevant information is really important to correctly solve a problem. We run into functional fixedness, where we only see things as being able to do the thing that they're supposed to do. So I mentioned that using the table in part of my solution is breaking this idea of functional fixedness. People don't necessarily think to use the other stuff in the room. So we're told that, yeah, you have a screwdriver and matches and cotton, but we now know they're on a table. So in my mind, I would just move the table. But we also run into situations where, same basic setup, they give people a box with candle and matches and pins and cardboard. And they say, set something up so that the candle doesn't drip wax on the table. And most people will start pinning things into the cardboard on the wall and using like cardboard to keep the wax off the table. But you could also just put the candle in the box, because people see it as a container that was used to deliver things. They don't assume that it's part of the setup. Yep. Possibly. If they don't specify, which actually comes to our last point here, unnecessary constraints, where we tend to assume that certain conditions have to be met. So not using the container that it came in, or not rearranging the furniture, or not burning the string. And even on the next slide, we have these 9 dots, and they say, without lifting your pencil, draw 4 lines and connect all the dots. In order to solve this, you have to draw outside of the boundary box. So you have to go outside of that square. So the solution requires you to sort of break an unspoken constraint that people assume they can't break. And then mental sets are basically these rules where we have solved this problem in the past, and so we follow along with what we've done successfully in the past, even if there are better solutions available. So in that water jug test, we had take the big one and then subtract 1 of the medium ones and 2 of the small ones. If I changed the values from what we had on the slide before to new ones, the first thing you might try would be 1 large one, take away 1 medium, and take away 2 small. And that might solve the problem, but maybe you didn't check that 2 of the medium ones got you to the total that you needed anyways. And in a lot of cases, when they give you sequential problems to solve, people will defer back to a solution that worked previously instead of finding a new one that's even more efficient. So we get stuck in our mental sets. Probably. I don't know a ton of the research, but that ability to think outside of the box would definitely be influenced. I'm not quite sure how, but I'd kind of love to find out. All right, perfect. And that's what I wanted to cover today. So we will leave it here, and we're going to finish off with sort of problem solving. We only have 10 more slides. So we are absolutely going to finish in Wednesday's class, which is the intent. That leaves us with Friday to sit down and talk about review questions and anything you want to go over about the final. Yep. Yeah.